In the dense swamplands of South Carolina, where Spanish moss hangs like funeral shrouds and the air itself seems to whisper of forgotten sins, lie the crumbling remains of what locals once called the Angels' Rest Chapel. Between 1789 and 1832, over 200 souls vanished without a trace after seeking refuge at this supposed sanctuary. Discovered in 1923 and immediately sealed by authorities, church records revealed meticulous documentation of systematic murder disguised as divine mercy. The Whitworth family, pillars of their community and operators of the mysterious Order of Fallen Angels, had turned their plantation chapel into the most profitable killing ground in the antebellum South. What you're about to hear has been buried for nearly 2 centuries. But the truth about America's most sinister religious family can no longer remain hidden. Before we unveil the horrifying depths of the Whitworth legacy, understand this story isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to face the darkest chapters of American history. If you're ready to join our community of true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We need to know how far these dark secrets are traveling. Now, let's step back into the shadows of 1789 South Carolina, where salvation came with a price no soul should ever pay. But to understand how such calculated evil could flourish requires us to examine the world that created the Whitworth dynasty. The year was 1789, and the newly formed United States was still bleeding from the wounds of revolution. In the low country of South Carolina, where rice plantations stretched endlessly toward the Atlantic, the social order remained as rigid as the tides that flooded the coastal marshes twice daily. It was here, 30 miles inland from Charleston, that the Whitworth family had carved out their empire of deception. Gabriel Whitworth was 43 years old when he purchased the 1,000-acre tract he would name Seraphim's Grace. Standing 6 feet tall with prematurely silver hair and eyes the color of winter ice, Gabriel possessed a commanding presence that made lesser men step aside when he entered a room. Cultured and resonant, his voice could fill a chapel or reduce a grown man to trembling silence with equal ease. Born into Virginia's declining planter aristocracy, Gabriel had watched his family's tobacco fortune crumble during the Revolutionary War. But where others saw ruin, Gabriel saw opportunity. His wife, Constance Whitworth née Napton, came from old Charleston money, her family's wealth built on the slave trade and rice cultivation. At 38, Constance remained beautiful in a fragile, ethereal way that reminded visitors of porcelain dolls. Her dark hair was always perfectly arranged, and her pale hands never showed the calluses of honest work. But those who looked closely into her brown eyes saw something troubling, a kind of vacant distance, as if part of her mind had retreated to a place where the horrors around her couldn't reach. Each of the Whitworth children was remarkable in their own disturbing way. Ezekiel, 24, and the heir apparent, possessed his father's calculating intelligence, but with an added cruelty that even Gabriel sometimes found unsettling. Tall and lean like his father, Ezekiel's smile never quite reached his dark eyes. He had studied briefly at the College of Charleston before his father recalled him to manage the family's more delicate operations. Perhaps the most dangerous of all the Whitworth offspring was Miriam, 22. Where her brothers used force and intimidation, Miriam employed charm and manipulation. She could make a desperate runaway feel completely safe while leading them directly to their death. Conventional was her beauty, golden hair, blue eyes, a sweet smile. But there was something in her manner that suggested she found genuine pleasure in others' suffering. The twins, Cain and Abel, had just turned 20. Cain was the larger of the two with broad shoulders and hands that looked capable of strangling a man. Abel was slighter, more thoughtful, but his intelligence was focused entirely on devising new methods of extracting information from unwilling subjects. The boys had been raised to see themselves as instruments of divine justice, and they approached their work with the methodical precision of craftsmen. Young Lilith, only 16, was still developing her role in the family enterprise. Blonde, like her sister, but with her father's piercing gaze, she possessed an unsettling maturity that made visitors uncomfortable. Gabriel was grooming her to take over Miriam's duties when the time came. The family business, after all, required continuity. Gabriel's brother, Michael Whitworth, served as the plantation's official overseer and Gabriel's closest collaborator. 2 years younger than Gabriel, Michael had the weathered look of a man who spent his days in the field. But his education matched his brother's. He understood that their operation required both brutality and careful record-keeping. Michael's wife Ruth had died in childbirth 5 years earlier, leaving him to raise their twin daughters, Mercy and Grace, now 13. The girls lived in the main house with their cousins, receiving the same careful education in the family's particular brand of theology. The most chilling member of the family was perhaps the youngest brother, Raphael Whitworth, who insisted everyone call him Seraph. 35 and thin to the point of appearing gaunt with prematurely white hair and pale green eyes, Seraph had studied medicine at Edinburgh before the Revolution. His medical knowledge made him invaluable to the family's operations, though he had never practiced legitimate medicine. Instead, he used his skills to keep victims alive longer during interrogations and to ensure that the bodies they eventually sold to medical schools appeared to have died from natural causes. Perfectly designed for their sinister purposes was the Whitworth plantation itself. The main house, an imposing 3-story Georgian structure, sat on a slight rise overlooking the rice fields, but it was the smaller buildings that served the family's true business. The chapel, completed in 1788, stood half a mile from the main house, connected by a path that wound through a grove of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss. The building was larger than most plantation chapels with room for 200 worshippers, though the Whitworth congregation rarely exceeded 50 locals. Unique to the chapel were the modifications Gabriel had ordered during construction. The basement, accessed through a hidden door behind the altar, had been designed as a series of holding cells. The walls were thick enough to muffle screams, and the ventilation system ensured that occupants could be kept alive for extended periods. Adjacent to the chapel stood what appeared to be a simple outbuilding used for storing religious materials. In reality, it housed Seraph's medical laboratory and the tools of his trade. The family had established their Order of Fallen Angels in 1789, presenting it to the local community as a Methodist revival movement focused on bringing salvation to the most desperate souls. They held regular services inviting neighboring planters and their families to witness Gabriel's passionate sermons about redemption through suffering. The local Methodist circuit rider, Reverend Thomas Hartwell, initially welcomed the Whitworths' religious enthusiasm, even allowing Gabriel to conduct special services for seekers in spiritual distress. But the order's true purpose was far more sinister. Through a network of contacts in Charleston, Savannah, and as far north as Richmond, the Whitworths spread carefully crafted rumors about their chapel. Word reached slave quarters throughout the region that Angel's Rest was a sanctuary where runaways could find food, shelter, and guidance to freedom. The stories were specific enough to be believable, detailed descriptions of the chapel's location, passwords to identify genuine seekers, and testimonials from supposed escapees who had successfully reached the north. The elaborate deception required careful coordination. Seraph maintained correspondence with medical schools in Charleston, Savannah, Richmond, and even Philadelphia, establishing himself as a reliable supplier of cadavers for anatomical study. The bodies were always presented as those of free persons of color who had died of natural causes, complete with forged documentation. Medical schools in the early Republic asked few questions about the source of their specimens, and Seraph's prices were always reasonable. Michael handled the practical aspects of the operation, managing the legitimate plantation business that provided cover for their activities, maintaining the network of informants who spread word about the sanctuary, and coordinating with professional slave catchers who helped identify the most valuable targets. The family's legitimate rice plantation was moderately successful, employing nearly 100 enslaved workers who lived in relative comfort compared to other plantations. This benevolent reputation was carefully cultivated, with Gabriel allowing his workers better food, housing, and even limited movement around the plantation. The most diabolical aspect of the Whitworth operation was how they used genuine religious faith as a weapon. Gabriel's sermons were powerful and moving, filled with biblical references and theological sophistication that impressed even educated listeners. He truly believed that he was doing God's work, convinced that the souls he sent to their deaths were predestined for damnation anyway. This theological framework allowed the entire family to participate in mass murder while maintaining their sense of moral superiority. Local authorities knew something unusual was happening at Seraphim's Grace, but the Whitworths had been careful to establish themselves as pillars of the community. Gabriel served on the county commission, contributed generously to local churches, and hosted elaborate social gatherings that cemented his family's place in planter society. When occasional questions arose about missing slaves or strangers seen in the area, the Whitworths expressed appropriate concern and offered to help with searches. The autumn of 1791 brought unusual activity to Seraphim's Grace. A series of devastating storms had damaged crops throughout the Low Country, creating economic hardship that drove more enslaved people to attempt escape. For the Whitworths, this represented unprecedented opportunity. In a single month, 43 desperate souls arrived at Angel's Rest Chapel seeking sanctuary. It was during this period that the family's methods became most refined. Ezekiel had developed a system for categorizing new arrivals based on their potential value. Young, healthy males were kept alive longest, as their information about plantation defenses and escape routes proved most valuable to professional slave catchers. Women with children were questioned about other families planning to escape, their desperation making them particularly forthcoming. Older escapees, who typically knew less useful information, were dispatched quickly to minimize resources spent on their maintenance. The process always began the same way. New arrivals were greeted by Miriam, whose gentle manner and obvious education made her seem like an angel of mercy. She would provide food, clean clothing, and a safe place to rest while explaining that the family needed to verify their stories before helping them continue north. This waiting period, she explained, was necessary to protect both the escapees and the Underground Railroad network. During these first days, the Whitworths gathered intelligence through seemingly casual conversation. Miriam excelled at drawing out information about families left behind, planned meeting points and contacts in the north. Gabriel would visit the chapel daily, conducting prayer services that gradually revealed more about each person's background and connections. The twins, Cain and Abel, posed as runaway slaves from other plantations, sharing fabricated stories of successful escapes to build trust and encourage more detailed confessions. Once the family had extracted all useful information, the victims were moved to the chapel's basement. Seraph's medical training proved invaluable here, as he could keep subjects conscious and responsive far longer than crude torture methods would allow. The basement contained 5 individual cells, each equipped with shackles and designed to prevent any possibility of escape. So effective was the soundproofing that the chapel's regular congregation, meeting directly above, never heard the suffering below. The interrogation process typically lasted 3 to 5 days. Seraph used his knowledge of human anatomy to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that might affect the eventual sale of the body. He had developed a detailed understanding of pressure points, nerve pathways, and psychological techniques that broke resistance without leaving obvious marks. Abel assisted with these sessions, taking careful notes about information revealed and cross-referencing details with previous victims' testimonies. What made the Whitworth operation particularly effective was their systematic approach to record-keeping. Gabriel maintained detailed ledgers documenting every aspect of their business. Each victim was assigned a number and had a complete file including physical description, background information, intelligence gathered, and ultimate disposition. These records allowed the family to track patterns in escape routes, identify key figures in the Underground Railroad, and provide valuable intelligence to their network of professional slave catchers. The family had established partnerships with 3 major slave catching operations covering territory from Virginia to Georgia. These professional bounty hunters paid premium prices for detailed information about escape routes, safe houses, and planned flights. A single successful raid based on Whitworth intelligence could net rewards of thousands of dollars, money that was split between the family and their criminal partners. But it was the body trade that provided the most consistent profits. Seraph's connections with medical schools had grown into a sophisticated supply network. Bodies were preserved using techniques he had learned in Edinburgh, packaged in specially designed containers and shipped with forged documentation identifying them as free persons of color who had died of natural causes. The family earned between $50 and $100 per body, depending on the specimen's condition and the receiving institution's needs. Young Lilith began participating in the family business during this period, initially serving as an additional friendly face to greet new arrivals. Her youth and apparent innocence made desperate people even more trusting. Gabriel was pleased to see that she showed no emotional reaction to the suffering around her, suggesting that she would be able to take on greater responsibilities as she matured. The most horrifying aspect of the operation was how the family maintained their public facade. Every Sunday they attended services at the local Methodist church where Gabriel often served as a lay preacher. They hosted elaborate dinner parties, contributed to charity drives, and participated in all the social activities expected of prominent planters. Constance became known for her beautiful needlework and her skill at organizing ladies' auxiliary functions. By 1795, the Whitworth operation had grown beyond anything Gabriel had originally envisioned. What began as an opportunistic scheme to profit from the chaos of the early republic had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise spanning for states. The family's success had attracted the attention of other like-minded individuals, leading to the formation of what they called the Southern Redemption Society. The society's membership included plantation owners, merchants, professional slave catchers, corrupt officials, and even a few ministers who shared Gabriel's twisted theology. Monthly meetings were held at rotating locations, usually disguised as religious revivals or social gatherings. Members paid dues based on their profits from society-related activities, and these funds were used to expand operations and corrupt officials who might otherwise interfere. Dr. Edmund Thorne, who ran a medical practice in Charleston, became one of the society's most valuable members. His legitimate medical credentials allowed him to provide death certificates for the bodies Serif supplied to medical schools. Thorne also had connections with ship captains who transported specimens to northern institutions, ensuring that the supply chain remained undetected by authorities. Captain Marcus Fulton controlled a network of professional slave catchers operating throughout the Carolinas and Georgia. His men specialized in tracking down specific individuals based on intelligence provided by the Whitworths. Fulton's operation was particularly brutal, often capturing entire families when they learned of planned escapes. The captain paid the Whitworths a percentage of all rewards collected using their information. Perhaps most disturbing was the participation of Reverend Josiah Blackwood, a Methodist minister whose territory included 3 counties in eastern South Carolina. Blackwood used his position to identify potential escapees within his congregation, passing information to the Whitworths while maintaining the appearance of pastoral concern. He even conducted funeral services for some of the family's victims using forged documentation to claim they had died of fever or other natural causes. The society's growth required more sophisticated methods of operation. Gabriel developed a coded communication system that allowed members to share information without risk of detection. Letters discussing spiritual matters and redemption work contained detailed intelligence about escape routes, safe houses, and planned flights. This coded correspondence was discovered years later, providing historians with detailed documentation of the network's scope and methods. Serif's role evolved during this period from simple torturer to what would now be recognized as a forensic analyst. He developed detailed profiles of escape patterns, identifying the most commonly used routes and the seasonal variations in flight attempts. This intelligence allowed the society to position resources more effectively, intercepting escapees before they could reach genuine safe houses. The family's chapel became a training ground for new society members. Gabriel conducted special seminars on theological justification for difficult decisions, teaching participants how to rationalize their actions through selective biblical interpretation. Serif provided medical training showing attendees how to extract information without leaving obvious evidence of torture. Even Miriam contributed, teaching manipulation techniques that made victims more cooperative. During this expansion period, the Whitworths processed an average of 60 victims per year. The chapel's basement was enlarged to accommodate 12 cells, and additional soundproofing was installed. A new crematorium disguised as a pottery kiln was constructed to dispose of remains that couldn't be profitably sold to medical schools. The family employed 6 additional workers, all society members, to handle the increased volume of their operations. Young Lilith, now 18, had become fully integrated into the family business. Her specialty was handling female victims, particularly those traveling with children. She had developed a maternal persona that made desperate mothers trust her completely. Lilith would care for children while their parents were being interrogated, sometimes using threats against the young ones to encourage cooperation. Her complete lack of empathy combined with her nurturing appearance made her perhaps the most effective member of the family. The twins, Cain and Abel, had developed complementary specialties. Kane handled the physical aspects of the operation, maintaining the facilities, managing transportation, and disposing of evidence. Abel focused on intelligence analysis, maintaining the detailed records that made the operation so profitable. Together, they had created a system efficient enough to process victims within 48 hours of arrival, maximizing profits while minimizing risks. But the society's success was drawing unwanted attention. Abolitionists in the North had begun noticing patterns in the disappearances of escaped slaves. Several newspaper articles mentioned the unusual number of runaways who seemed to vanish completely after leaving plantations in the South Carolina Low Country. Underground Railroad conductors reported losing contact with escapees who had been directed to safe houses in the region. The winter of 1798 brought an unexpected visitor to the South Carolina Low Country. Jeremiah Morrison, a Quaker merchant from Philadelphia, arrived in Charleston under the pretense of establishing trade relationships with local rice planters. In reality, Morrison was conducting a covert investigation for the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, trying to determine why so many escaped slaves who had successfully reached the Mason-Dixon line reported losing friends and family members somewhere in South Carolina. Morrison was a careful man, 45 years old, with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent years in dangerous places. His Quaker faith had driven him to risk his life multiple times helping escapees reach freedom, and he had developed an intuitive sense for detecting deception. Something about the stories coming out of South Carolina didn't feel right to him. The investigation began with Morrison interviewing successful escapees in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston. Pattern after pattern emerged from their testimonies. Many had been told about a sanctuary called Angel's Rest where they could find food and guidance. Some had actually visited the chapel, but left quickly, reporting that something felt wrong about the place. Others had sent friends or family members there only to never hear from them again. Morrison spent weeks documenting these accounts, cross-referencing locations, dates, and descriptions. The pattern was clear. People were disappearing at a specific location in the South Carolina Low Country. But proving what was happening required someone to infiltrate the operation, and Morrison knew that his skin color made him unsuitable for such a mission. The solution came from an unexpected source. Samuel Washington, a free black man from Baltimore who had been educated in Pennsylvania, volunteered to pose as an escaped slave seeking passage north. Washington was light-skinned enough to potentially pass for mixed race, which might explain his education and refined manner. More importantly, he was utterly fearless, having already conducted similar investigations in Virginia and Maryland. Washington arrived in Charleston in March 1799, carrying forged documents identifying him as the property of a fictional Virginia planter. He spent several weeks working as a day laborer, quietly gathering information about local Underground Railroad contacts. It didn't take long for him to hear whispers about the sanctuary at Angel's Rest Chapel. The approach was gradual and careful. Washington made contact with other people seeking to escape, allowing word of his situation to spread naturally through the underground network. Within a month, he was approached by a contact who provided directions to the Whitworth plantation and the passwords needed to identify himself as a legitimate seeker. Morrison, meanwhile, had established himself in Charleston's business community, using his legitimate merchant credentials to gain access to shipping records, medical college correspondence, and other documents that might reveal the scope of whatever criminal enterprise was operating in the region. His Quaker connections in Philadelphia had provided him with names of medical professors who might be receiving suspicious specimens. What Morrison discovered shocked even his experienced mind. Shipping records showed regular deliveries from South Carolina to medical schools throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. The volume was far too high to represent normal mortality among the region's free black population. Death certificates provided by local physicians showed suspicious patterns, too many deaths from fever and natural causes among people described as transient free blacks. Washington's mission began on a humid April evening when he approached Angel's Rest Chapel following the instructions he had received. The building appeared exactly as described, larger than most plantation chapels, with Gothic windows that seemed oddly foreboding in the fading light. Spanish moss hung from the surrounding oaks like funeral shrouds, and the air was thick with the smell of stagnant water from nearby rice fields. Miriam Whitworth greeted him at the chapel door, her smile warm and welcoming. She was exactly as beautiful as the stories had suggested, with golden hair and eyes that seemed to radiate compassion. Washington felt an immediate sense of danger. Something about her perfect performance struck him as rehearsed, as if she had done this many times before. "You must be so tired, poor soul," Miriam said, leading him inside the chapel. "Come, let me get you some food and a safe place to rest. Tomorrow, we'll discuss your journey north." The chapel's interior was more elaborate than Washington had expected. The stained glass windows depicted scenes of divine judgment that seemed unusually violent for a Methodist sanctuary. The altar was carved from dark wood, and behind it hung a painting of the Archangel Michael casting demons into hell. Everything about the space felt theatrical, as if designed to inspire fear rather than comfort. Washington was provided with simple food and clean clothes, then shown to a small room adjacent to the chapel where he could spend the night. Miriam explained that the family needed to verify his story before helping him continue north, a precaution necessary to protect both him and their network. This waiting period, she assured him, rarely lasted more than a few days. During his second day at the plantation, Washington met other members of the Whitworth family. Gabriel appeared every bit the benevolent patriarch, conducting prayer services and offering spiritual guidance to the desperate souls seeking refuge. His sermons were powerful and moving, filled with references to liberation and redemption that seemed perfectly suited to his audience. But Washington's trained eye began noticing troubling details. The other guests at the plantation seemed unusually subdued, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact. When he tried to engage them in conversation about their backgrounds or travel plans, they provided vague, inconsistent answers. Most disturbing was the way they looked at the Whitworth family members with a mixture of gratitude and terror that suggested they knew more than they were saying. On his third night, Washington was awakened by sounds that made his blood run cold. Muffled screams were coming from somewhere beneath the chapel, barely audible through the thick walls, but unmistakably human. He lay perfectly still, listening to the agonized cries until they finally stopped just before dawn. When he mentioned the sounds to other guests the next morning, they claimed to have heard nothing. Washington realized that he was in mortal danger, but he also understood that he might be the only person who could expose this operation. He began making careful observations, noting the layout of buildings, the number of family members, and the patterns of activity around the plantation. Most importantly, he started looking for evidence of what was happening to the people who arrived at Angel's Rest, but never left. The breakthrough came when Washington observed Sheriff Whitworth loading a wagon with what appeared to be wooden crates. The crates were the right size and shape to contain human bodies, and they were being loaded with the careful attention typically reserved for valuable cargo. Washington followed the wagon from a distance, watching as it traveled to a landing on the Ashley River, where a small steamboat was waiting. But Washington had been observed as well. Abel Whitworth had noticed his curious behavior and reported it to his father. Gabriel decided that their guest was becoming too inquisitive and ordered his transfer to the chapel basement. Washington's investigation was about to become a personal fight for survival. Washington's descent into the chapel basement revealed the true scope of the Whitworth family's evil. The underground facility was far more sophisticated than he had imagined, with 12 individual cells, a medical laboratory, and what appeared to be a crematorium. The smell of death hung in the air like a physical presence, and the walls bore stains that no amount of cleaning could remove. He was placed in a cell that showed evidence of previous occupants. Scratches in the stone walls where desperate fingernails had tried to claw through solid rock, and darker stains that Washington didn't want to identify. The cell was barely large enough for him to lie down, with no furniture except a bucket for waste and a small opening near the ceiling that provided minimal ventilation. Within hours of his imprisonment, Washington heard other prisoners in nearby cells. Their whispered conversations revealed the full horror of what was happening. Some had been there for weeks, kept alive only long enough to provide information about escape routes, underground railroad contacts, and other planned flights. Others were newer arrivals who still held hope that they might be released. The interrogations began immediately. Sheriff Whitworth proved to be a methodical torturer, using his medical knowledge to inflict maximum pain while avoiding permanent damage that might affect the eventual sale of the body. He worked with surgical precision, asking detailed questions about underground railroad operations while applying carefully calculated physical pressure. Washington's education and obvious intelligence made him particularly valuable to the Whitworths. They suspected he might be connected to abolitionists in the North, and they were determined to extract information about Underground Railroad financing and organization. The torture sessions lasted hours, with Serif demonstrating a disturbing enthusiasm for his work. But Washington had been prepared for this possibility. His training in Philadelphia had included instruction on resisting interrogation, and his Quaker faith provided him with inner strength that his captors couldn't break. He fed them false information mixed with enough truth to seem credible, buying time while he looked for an opportunity to escape. The opportunity came from an unexpected source. Grace Whitworth, one of Michael's 13-year-old twin daughters, had been bringing food to the prisoners as part of her education in the family business. Unlike her relatives, Grace seemed genuinely disturbed by the suffering around her. Washington began talking with her during these brief visits, gradually building her trust while planting seeds of doubt about her family's activities. Grace was intelligent enough to understand that what her family was doing was wrong, but she had been raised to believe that their victims were predestined for damnation anyway. Washington's gentle theological arguments, combined with his obvious education and refinement, began to shake her faith in the family's twisted doctrine. More importantly, she began to see him as a human being rather than simply another specimen for processing. The escape plan required careful timing and considerable luck. Grace agreed to leave Washington's cell unlocked during her next food delivery, giving him access to the laboratory where Serif kept his surgical instruments. Armed with a scalpel, Washington would have to make his way through the plantation at night, avoiding the family and their workers while reaching the Ashley River, where he could steal a boat. But the plan went wrong almost immediately. Grace's unusual behavior had been noticed by her sister Mercy, who reported the suspicious activity to their father, Michael. When Washington tried to leave his cell, he found Abel Whitworth waiting for him with a pistol and a vicious smile. "Did you really think we wouldn't notice?" Abel asked, gesturing for Washington to return to his cell. "Poor little Grace thought she was saving your soul. Instead, she's just ensured that your death will be much more unpleasant than we originally planned." Washington was returned to his cell, but the failed escape attempt had revealed something important. There were cracks in the family's unity. Grace's willingness to help him suggested that other family members might be having doubts about their activities. More importantly, the incident had forced the Whitworths to accelerate their timeline for his disposal. That night, Washington heard voices in the laboratory. Gabriel and Serif discussing the best way to handle their problematic prisoner. Gabriel wanted to extract as much information as possible before killing him. But Serif was concerned that Washington's obvious intelligence and education made him too dangerous to keep alive much longer. They decided to conduct one final interrogation session using methods that would likely prove fatal. But Washington had one more card to play. During his weeks of captivity, he had been making careful mental notes about everything he observed. The layout of the facility, the names and faces of family members, the details of their operation. More importantly, he had been memorizing the information provided by other prisoners, building a comprehensive picture of the Underground Railroad network that the Whitworths were systematically destroying. When Serif arrived for the final interrogation, Washington offered to provide detailed information about abolitionist financing and organization in exchange for a quick death rather than prolonged torture. The offer was compelling enough to make Serif pause and consider. He knew that such intelligence would be enormously valuable to their Southern Redemption Society partners. What Serif didn't realize was that Washington was buying time for a rescue attempt. Jeremiah Morrison, growing concerned about his partner's extended absence, had begun making discreet inquiries about Angel's Rest Chapel. His investigation had attracted the attention of other abolitionists in Charleston, including several free black workers who had heard rumors about the plantation's activities. The rescue came at dawn on a humid June morning when fog from the Ashley River provided perfect cover for Morrison's small team of volunteers. They had spent weeks planning the assault, studying the plantation's layout, and identifying the most likely location for Washington's imprisonment. The team included Morrison, 2 other Quakers from Philadelphia, and 4 free black men from Charleston who had volunteered for the dangerous mission. The attack began with a diversionary fire set in one of the plantation's rice processing buildings. While the Whitworth family and their workers rushed to contain the blaze, Morrison's team infiltrated the chapel and discovered the entrance to the basement facility. What they found there exceeded their worst fears. 11 prisoners were still alive in the underground cells, including Washington, who was barely conscious after his final interrogation session. The laboratory contained detailed records of the family's activities, ledgers documenting over 800 murders, correspondence with medical schools throughout the Mid-Atlantic region, and maps showing underground railroad routes that had been compromised by information extracted from victims. But the most horrifying discovery was Serif's medical journal, which contained detailed descriptions of his torture techniques and observations about the effectiveness of different methods for extracting information. The journal revealed that he had been using the prisoners as test subjects for what he called enhanced interrogation research, systematically documenting the physical and psychological limits of human endurance. The rescue team had planned to escape immediately after freeing the prisoners, but Washington insisted on gathering as much evidence as possible. Despite his injuries, he helped collect the most incriminating documents while Morrison's men prepared the survivors for transport. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the fire would be controlled and the family would discover their underground chamber had been breached. The evidence they collected would eventually expose not only the Whitworth family's crimes, but the entire Southern Redemption Society network. Letters between society members revealed similar operations in Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, all following the same basic model of false sanctuaries that lured escapees to their deaths. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond anything Morrison had imagined. But Gabriel Whitworth had not built his empire by being careless. When the fire was finally controlled and he realized what had happened, he immediately began implementing contingency plans that he had developed for exactly this situation. The family had escape routes prepared, and more importantly, they had powerful allies who would help them avoid prosecution. The Whitworths' political connections proved their salvation. Gabriel had spent years cultivating relationships with judges, sheriffs, and state legislators who owed their positions to planter support. When Morrison's evidence was presented to local authorities, it was dismissed as fabricated propaganda designed to inflame tensions between North and South. The few officials who took the accusation seriously found themselves facing intense pressure from their political patrons. Federal authorities in Charleston were more receptive to Morrison's evidence, but they lacked jurisdiction over crimes committed entirely within South Carolina. The Constitution's guarantee of state sovereignty over internal affairs meant that federal prosecutors could not pursue cases against South Carolina citizens without state cooperation. That cooperation was never forthcoming. Most frustrating for Morrison was the reaction of the local Methodist church hierarchy. Despite overwhelming evidence of the Whitworths' crimes, church leaders were reluctant to condemn a family that had contributed so generously to religious causes. Reverend Hartwell, the circuit rider who had originally welcomed Gabriel's ministry, claimed that the accusations were part of a northern conspiracy to discredit Southern Christianity. The Whitworth family used this breathing space to relocate their operation. Within 6 months of Morrison's raid, they had sold Seraphim's Grace Plantation and moved west to Alabama, where territorial status provided even less oversight than South Carolina's state government. They established a new plantation near Mobile, complete with another chapel and another underground facility. But Morrison's investigation had damaged the Southern Redemption Society's network beyond repair. Several key members, fearing exposure, abandoned the conspiracy and destroyed their records. Dr. Thorne fled to the Caribbean. Captain Fulton disappeared entirely and Reverend Blackwood suddenly found religion and began preaching genuinely about the evils of slavery. Washington's testimony combined with the evidence collected from the chapel basement was published in abolitionist newspapers throughout the North. The detailed accounts of systematic torture and murder conducted under the guise of religious ministry shocked even hardened activists. The Whitworth case became a rallying cry for the growing abolitionist movement, proving that slavery's defenders would resort to any means to protect their interests. The Whitworth family's relocation to Alabama marked a new phase in their criminal enterprise. The territorial government provided even less oversight than South Carolina, and the rapid influx of settlers created perfect conditions for their false sanctuary operation. They established their new plantation, New Seraphim, 20 miles north of Mobile, where the Tombigbee River provided convenient access to shipping routes. Gabriel had learned from the Charleston experience that maintaining political connections was essential for long-term survival. He immediately began cultivating relationships with territorial officials, contributing generously to their campaigns, and hosting elaborate social events that cemented his family's place in Alabama society. Within 2 years, he had been appointed to the Territorial Council, giving him direct influence over law enforcement policies. The new chapel was even more sophisticated than its South Carolina predecessor. Gabriel had hired an architect from New Orleans who designed a structure that appeared to be a conventional Methodist church while concealing an underground complex capable of holding 30 prisoners simultaneously. The facility included improved soundproofing, better ventilation, and a medical laboratory that surpassed anything Serif had previously operated. But the family's methods had evolved as well. The failure in Charleston had taught them that relying entirely on false sanctuaries was too risky. They began developing multiple approaches to their criminal enterprise, including legitimate slave trading that provided cover for their more sinister activities. Gabriel obtained a license as a slave trader, allowing him to transport and sell human beings legally while using the business to identify potential victims for his underground operation. The legitimate slave trading business proved enormously profitable and provided perfect cover for their criminal activities. Gabriel specialized in what he called problem slaves, individuals who had attempted escape, shown signs of rebellion, or possessed skills that made them particularly valuable. These slaves commanded premium prices. But more importantly, their disappearance could be easily explained as routine sales to distant plantations. Ezekiel had developed a particularly sinister innovation during the Alabama years. He began purchasing slaves specifically to torture information from them about underground railroad networks, then selling them to plantations so remote that escape was virtually impossible. This approach generated revenue while still providing the intelligence that made their false sanctuary operation so profitable. The family's network in Alabama proved even more extensive than their South Carolina connections. The territorial government was dominated by settlers from Georgia and the Carolinas, many of whom shared the Whitworths' views about the necessity of extreme measures to maintain social order. Several prominent planters became informal partners in the operation, providing intelligence about potential escapees and sharing in the profits from successful captures. Miriam had married Captain James Patterson, a former naval officer who commanded a riverboat on the Tombigbee. Patterson's vessel, the Sweet Salvation, became an essential component of the family's transportation network. Bodies destined for medical schools were shipped north via riverboat, while living captives were transported to remote locations where they could be held indefinitely without discovery. Young Lilith, now 22, had become the family's most effective operative. Her beauty and apparent innocence made her irresistible to men of all social classes, and she used these advantages to gather intelligence about escape plans, abolitionist activities, and underground railroad operations. She had established relationships with boat captains, merchants, and even federal officials, each believing that he was her only romantic interest. The twins, Cain and Abel, had developed complementary criminal enterprises that supported the family's main operation. Cain operated a blacksmith shop in Mobile that specialized in restraints and transportation equipment used by slave traders throughout the region. Abel had established himself as a dealer in curious medical specimens, providing anatomical oddities to medical schools and private collectors in the North and Europe. But it was Serif's medical research that represented the most chilling evolution of the family's activities. His years of experience torturing prisoners had given him unprecedented knowledge of human anatomy and psychology. He began conducting what he called enhanced medical research, using prisoners as test subjects for procedures that no legitimate physician would attempt. His detailed journals from this period discovered decades later revealed experiments that anticipated some of the worst medical crimes of the 20th century. The Alabama operation processed an average of 80 victims per year, making it the most prolific component of what remained of the Southern Redemption Society network. The underground facility beneath New Seraphims Chapel could hold 30 prisoners simultaneously, allowing for more systematic extraction of intelligence and more efficient processing of bodies for sale to medical institutions. By 1805, word of the Whitworth family's Alabama operation had begun reaching abolitionist networks in the North. Jeremiah Morrison, still haunted by his experiences in South Carolina, had spent years tracking the family's movements and documenting their continued activities. His detailed reports to the Pennsylvania Abolition Society painted a picture of systematic murder that exceeded anything previously documented in American criminal history. Morrison's investigation had attracted the attention of federal authorities in Washington, where Secretary of State James Madison was growing concerned about reports of criminal enterprises that threatened to destabilize relationships between northern and southern states. The Whitworth case had become a symbol of the extremes to which slavery's defenders would go, and its exposure was generating political pressure.